Hey guys, this is Brian Mounts over on turfmechanic.com and this channel. Today I'm coming to you with, let's call it talk about fertilizers. I want to talk about fertilizers. It's still the very end of winter, and although I'm sitting on a patch of grass that I woke up already, the rest of my lawn is still dormant. It's starting to come alive slowly. This is the time of year that we're doing soil tests. I'm in the process of doing a soil test right now. There will be a video coming out soon, and I'll link to it down in the description below. If you're doing a soil test, you're going to end up getting a report that shows you what you are, what you have a surplus in, what you're deficient in, kind of the ratios that you have with the macronutrients and the micronutrients. Today I want to talk about just the macronutrients, NPK. These are the main ones that are just stamped right on the side of every fertilizer bottle. This right here is a 2000. It's got some minors in there as well. You can dig onto the label and find out what minors your fertilizer contains. You can also usually find what kinds of nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium are used to create those numbers. I don't really want to go into that level of granularity today, but I do want to talk about how the nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus interact with each other in the lawn. So when it comes time to read our soil reports, if we're getting them at all, or if we're not getting them at all, we need to understand how much of these nutrients our lawns are actually using and how much we're applying that is either going to waste or isn't necessary at all. Let's talk about all that here in this video today. All right, for those of you who are new to the lawn care game and to fertilizing, let's really briefly summarize what NPK is. N is nitrogen. Nitrogen is what the grass and most plants use to fuel leaf growth. Grass, there is nothing but leaf. So growth that comes up comes from nitrogen. Nitrogen fuels leaf growth. P is phosphorus. Really, generally speaking, phosphorus is going to help with root development. Now, as the plant grows, it needs roots to support that growth. That's what the phosphorus does. Potassium, that's the K, generally speaking, is the plant's immune system. It fuels the immune system for the grass. So when the grass gets trampled on by big boots, when it gets frozen at the end of fall or the early part of spring, when it gets heat stress or drought stress, potassium gives the plant enough immune system to be able to fight these stressors off. Now, when we're fertilizing the lawn with N, P, and K, if we're adding in, then that means that we are pushing new growth. If we're adding P and K, then we are pushing root development and the immune system. The thing here to remember is you can't over-apply any of these products. If you over-apply nitrogen all at once, you could damage the plant or kill it, or the excess nitrogen will leach out through the grass, through the root zone of your grass, and enter the ground system, the groundwater system. And that's a contaminant. That's something that we don't want. The same thing with phosphorus. Phosphorus will do the same thing. Potassium, you don't want to, it's not going to contaminate things the way that nitrogen and phosphorus are, but you still don't want to over-apply it because then it's just a waste. Now, the next thing here to keep in mind, and this is something that even like experienced lawn enthusiasts don't quite get all the time, is your soil is basically like a bank account. It's not like when we fertilize, everything we put down goes into the soil and gets absorbed into the roots and then it's just gone. It stays in the soil. It's just like you get a paycheck and it goes to the bank account before you can use it. Now, if you lose a job, you've still got money in the bank account until you use it up. So in the lawn, if you stop fertilizing altogether, there's still nutrients in the bank account. The soil still holds nutrients that the grass is going to use to grow and stay healthy for as long as it can. Basically, if the environmental conditions are right, let's say it's not winter, and you've got adequate or enough nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in the soil, then your grass is going to start absorbing those things, using it to fuel growth and stay healthy. Now, obviously, this doesn't last forever. eventually the bank account runs dry, or at least gets low enough that although the grass might be able to grow, maybe there's not enough phosphorus or potassium in the lawn to support healthy growth. Possibly you have excess potassium and phosphorus, so your grass stays healthy, but if you start running low on nitrogen in the soil, in the lawn soil, then top growth is going to slow down because there's not enough nitrogen to push growth. But the growth that does happen is healthy growth. So if the soil is a bank account for our lawn, if it's the account balance of these macronutrients for our lawn, then you got to think to yourself, well, how much can it hold? That's what CEC is. It's the exchange capacity of nutrition, basically. Some soils have a very low CEC number, and these soils tend to be sandy. They tend to lack an abundance of organic matter, and essentially they can't hold as much nutrition in the soil. Basically, the soil particles can be overwhelmed quickly by applying too much fertilizer of any kind in any one session, or even over the course of a season if you're doing it too frequently. Now, obviously, it benefits lawn owners to have a higher CEC, and that is a topic for a completely another video because it's a very complicated and long-term process to increase your CEC number. Depending on the soil test that you run, if you run a soil test, you might be given your CEC number, but not every soil test is going to do that. The thing to remember today, for the purpose of this video, is that nitrogen fuels top growth. So if you're applying nitrogen, your grass is going to uptake more phosphorus and potassium. If you are not pushing nitrogen, then your grass does not require as much phosphorus and potassium. If you were to completely stop fertilizing with nitrogen over the course of a season, your grass would continue to pull from the account balance of your soil. It will continue to pull phosphorus and potassium to support the growth that it can do until those count balances run too low. Let's run through some other scenarios. Let's say, for instance, you under-fertilize one year with nitrogen and you over-fertilize with potassium and phosphorus. Let's say you don't go overboard and you don't have anything leaching out. The grass, if you were to analyze the grass in a lab at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year, you would find that the actual grass plant, like the tissue of the plant itself, would have the exact same amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in it at the beginning of the year as at the end of the year, even though you under-applied nitrogen. To reiterate, that's because the plant does not require as much phosphorus and potassium because the plant is not growing as quickly. However, if you then analyze the soil and compare it from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, you would find that since you under-applied or didn't apply nitrogen at all over the course of the season, the soil, like the account balance of nitrogen in the soil, is now lower, whereas the phosphorus and potassium are higher because you have been fertilizing with those instead of nitrogen. I keep pointing at this. This is a 2000. This is only nitrogen. Your plant is never going to uptake extra phosphorus, and it's never going to take up extra potassium, even if you apply an extra dose to it. It's always going to have the correct amount in it. It's not going to, the only time it will be deficient is if your soil is deficient and it can't uptake it. It's never going to uptake more than it needs. So if you're over applying these products, then all you're doing is you're adding to the soil, you're adding the nutrients to the soil and hoping that those nutrients can bind to soil particles to then be used later on. For soil testing, if you choose to do a soil test, you're going to find out which macro and micronutrients are sitting in your soil in abundance or in deficiency. In the case of an abundance of these things, as you push top growth with nitrogen, that nitrogen is going to use up the surplus that you have, whichever nutrient you're talking about. Here's another scenario that's common. Let's say a soil test tells you, or for some reason you just know, that your soil has adequate levels of nitrogen and phosphorus in it, but you are low on potassium. Let's say then you put down a product like Milorganite, which contains nitrogen and phosphorus, but no potassium. All right, your plants are going to grow because you're adding nitrogen to it. They will uptake phosphorus to support that growth, but if you're low on potassium, then that growth is going to come at the sacrifice of the health of your plant. So its ability to fend off disease and stress, basically stress. The immune system will be compromised because there isn't enough potassium in the soil to support healthy grass growth. It will grow, but it won't be as healthy. On the other side of the coin, if you've got a lot of nitrogen in your soil and you've got a lot of potassium in your soil, but you don't have a lot of phosphorus in the soil, and then you're fertilizing with nitrogen fertilizers, your grass is going to want to start growing. But the phosphorus levels, the account balance of your phosphorus levels are too low to support that growth through a healthy tissue system. It won't be able to build the root system necessary to feed it well, and the blades themselves, like the actual grass blades themselves, will not be as robust. They're just not going to grow as well if the phosphorus levels are deficient. So the takeaway here is you always need to remember that applying P and K alone to a soil is not going to improve the grass. The excess is going to be stored in the soil if the soil is capable of storing it. Now, most people who attempt to keep really nice lawns find that almost all grass types, with a few exceptions, do really well with about 3 to 4 pounds of nitrogen applied to the lawn every year. Now, obviously, there are people in your neighborhood who never fertilize at all, and their grass will still grow, but it's not the same. If you've got like a fine fescue lawn or a centipede lawn, you got to kind of cut these numbers in half. But if you're shooting for 4 pounds of nitrogen every year, the ratio that I think is optimal is an 8-2-5. So if you're putting down 4 pounds of nitrogen in a year, then you need a quarter of that, 1 pound of phosphorus in a given year, and you need what's 5 out of 8. You would need, was it like 2.5? It was like 2.5 pounds of potassium in a year. So over the course of a year, that's what you need, and it doesn't have to come all at the same time. So when you see products like this that are 20-00, you're applying only nitrogen to the lawn. But later in the year, you need to offset that by keeping the ratios in line. Because remember, we can't over-apply nitrogen and under-apply everything else, because then our account balances of potassium and phosphorus are going to drop over time. And we also can't over-apply the others, because they're eventually going to fill up the account balances, and then they'll start leaching out all over the place, a big old mess. You want to keep the ratios in line. So if you're applying this in a certain time of the year for green up, and later in the year, you're planning on putting down a liquid aeration product, which frequently has humic acids and potassium in it. They don't include nitrogen or phosphorus. That is a way of offsetting a product like this. You're putting nitrogen down in one part of the year, and you're putting down potassium in another part of the year. Lots of people, myself included, like to put down Milorganite, but I don't do it over the course of the entire year. I have an entire video about the mistakes people make with Milorganite, which you might want to take a look at. But Milorganite is heavy in phosphorus relative to nitrogen. It's a 3-to-1 ratio. So if you're putting something down like this down, later in the year, you put down a Milorganite, and that's going to offset the lack of phosphorus. And then later in the year, you put down a liquid aeration product or a standalone potassium product for the purpose of getting your needs met for the entire year. You can spread these things out. Now, the reason that I say an 8-2-5 for me is optimal is because I read studies. I don't know, I just read turf science studies. It's what I do for fun. Not that long ago, University of Nebraska, Lincoln put out a study showing where they fertilized a healthy turf lawn for a number of years using a 5:1:2 ratio. Over the course of the years, the grass continued to stay healthy and continued to grow vigorously, and plant tissue analysis showed that all ratios were basically stable for all of the time, except the soil ratios were changing. So over the course of the number of years that they did the study, the phosphorus levels in the soil were declining year over year, and the potassium levels in the soil were declining year over year. So basically the nitrogen was fueling growth, and there was enough material, enough nutrients in the soil to support that growth, but the account balances were declining. So eventually those nutritional stores would get low enough that the health and vigor of the plant would start to decline. So that tells me that a 5:1:2 ratio is not enough to support long-term health. You need more phosphorus and more potassium relative to the nitrogen to not only support healthy growth, but not deplete your soil of the nutrition that it needs to provide for your plant later on down the road, maybe even years down the road. So for me, I've selected 8:2:5. That's what I strive for. For every 4 pounds of nitrogen that I put down in a year, I want 1 pound of phosphorus, and I want 2.5 pounds of potassium. That can be achieved in any number of ways. So when I look at a product, even if I'm looking at the product for a different purpose, like for instance, a little bit later in the season, I'm going to be putting down ammonium sulfate on my lawn, not because it's a fertilizer, but because it's going to help acidify my soil ever so slightly right off the bat. Now, I have to keep track of that because that is nitrogen going down onto the ground, and I can't put that nitrogen down on the ground again. I need to offset it by adding the phosphorus and potassium at a later date. So I have to keep track of what goes down, and that way I can balance things out as the year goes on. As you plan for the year and you're planning for your fertilization schedule, having a little notebook where you can keep notes as to what you put down is quite helpful. Now, if you decide to pull a soil test, like I'm doing and a number of other lawn enthusiasts do, you're going to find which nutrients you are already in abundance of. One method of correcting that is by pushing nitrogen. Let's say, for instance, you're high in potassium. You can push nitrogen and phosphorus with a product like Milorganite, and that's going to push growth, and it's going to use up the excess store of potassium in the lawn, and it's going to get things back into balance. The same thing would go for if you had too much phosphorus in the soil. You could push nitrogen to push top growth and add potassium to your fertilization schedule, and that would push growth, and the growth would absorb or would use up some of that excess phosphorus in the soil, and it'd get things back into balance. That's a technique that you really kind of need to know your starting point to do. Now, in the coming weeks, I'm going to be coming out with a big mega video where I compare all of the soil test options. I'm not going to tell you need to do a soil test, but if you are tempted, definitely watch that video when it comes out, because it's totally unbiased. I'm looking at like 7 or 8 different soil tests. Anyway, this is kind of a complicated video with a bunch of numbers and things in it. I have a full written version of this thing down. Like I wrote, it's like 1,800 words. It's like almost an ebook. A written version of this linked down in the description over on my website. I suggest you go take a look at it. It's kind of hard to explain some of this stuff on the fly in these little monologues that I do. Take a look at that. There's also going to be a link to the study that I referenced too, in case you want to double check. And also I'd like to say, obviously I'm only talking about nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus in this video. Those are the macros. There are lots of micronutrients as well. Coming later in this season, at some point, I'm going to be doing some videos about some of the micronutrients, because not only do we need certain amounts of them, a lot of the macros and micros need to be in balance to work properly. So if you watch the video where I greened this up, you would have noticed that I put down some micronutrients, but not all micronutrients. I was really only concerned about a couple, because some micronutrients work with the macros. So you can really get granular with the dials if you want to, once you understand how these nutrients work with each other. So anyway, I hope you look forward to the videos like that as they come out in the near future. Definitely hit that like button if you found this video helpful at all, interesting at all. If you have comments, drop them down below. I'd love to see you down there, and I'd love to see you in another video down the road. Thank you very much for your time, and wherever it is, I got a spring lawn care guide. Make sure to watch it. It's going to give you just about everything you need to know about getting your lawn looking great for the spring and for the whole rest of the year. Thank you for your time.